This is Talking Foreign Policy, a critical look at Canada's role abroad, and I'm Eve Engler. Today, we're going to discuss the war on Venezuela that Donald Trump's administration is ratcheting up, bombing vessels, threatening to invade, giving CIA directives to try to overthrow the government in Venezuela. And to discuss this, we have Joe Emesberger, who is the co-author of the book Extraordinary Threat: The U.S. Empire, the Media, and 20 Years of Coup Attempts in Venezuela. Thanks a lot for coming on Talking Foreign Policy, Joe. And can you just kind of give us a sense of what's happened in recent weeks with Trump's attacks and threats against Venezuela?
Yeah, I see what we're seeing now. I think is a very intensified version of what we saw in 2019. In 2019, Trump very menacingly brought so-called aid to the Colombian border. There were open efforts by Rubio, Bolton, and those guys on Twitter, everything directly contacting Venezuelan military, telling them you'd better defect if you want to save your families. You'd better abandon Maduro because his time is up. It was a huge. There were a lot of people, very informed people at the time, including me, who thought, "Oh, gee, I wonder if they're going to actually invade." It was very scary, and it turned out to be a big bluff. But this version, the version we're seeing now, is much more intensified because now you have these extrajudicial executions in the Caribbean. You have this outlandish pretext, the drug pretext, which is just invented out of whole cloth just by Trump just in recent years. That was never the propaganda against Venezuela for decades. It was never a significant part. Now it's a huge part. You know, everything's drugs and narcos and this and that. It's just so obviously false. But they're following through with executions. They're much more menacing. They're flying B-2 bombers uh, near Venezuela. I think it's a more intensified effort. And what worries me is that they might actually this time the effort to overthrow the government, to entice a coup of some kind, might involve military strikes, not just bluster, but just actually strikes on Venezuela. Maybe a decapitation attempt, like they did with Iran, like they've done with Iran, attempted to do with Iran, and partially successfully through not through with the Israelis. So that's what worries me. That it's a ramped up version, but at this time it's going to be much worse, and it could involve actual military strikes. I think the U.S. wants to do things on the cheap. They want regime change on the cheap. They probably want to to fracture the Venezuelan military somehow with these intense threats and get them to turn on Maduro. I think that's more likely than an invasion because that's expensive, and I don't think they want to go there with all the other commitments. I could be wrong, of course, but that's my hunch.
So yeah, so they've blown up I think six or seven different vessels. They killed multiple, I think it's multiple dozens, some of whom are Venezuelans, some of whom are Colombians, and a bit I understand maybe Trinidad and Tobago. Um, so I mean they are just, killing people and justifying it all through drugs or war on drugs or whatever they claim exactly on that front. Can you maybe, yeah, I guess you've written a bit about that, about the sort of lies, this sort of creation of this notion of a drug threat or whatever. Can you maybe talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Like the book that I wrote with Justin followed the propaganda over 20 years very closely. And I mean, not to say that you couldn't find right wingers here and there making all kinds of allegations, including drug allegations, but the bulk of the propaganda from the US was overwhelmingly about Venezuela as a dictatorship. It's a humanitarian crisis. We have to intervene on those grounds. From 2020 on, it seemed Trump invented this whole thing about drugs. There's no support for it in any UN report or any. I wrote an article recently with Roger Harris looking at the UN reports and other U.S. sources showing that overwhelmingly the drugs that comes through the illegal drugs that comes to the United States comes from the Colombia, and now Ecuador is a huge point of transferring drugs to the U.S. So Venezuela, there's never been any support whatsoever, and you can find it even in the media if you look at it for decades. There's never been any support for that. So he invented it out of the whole cloth. It seems it's just maybe it was focus group tested that it's easier to get a regime change strategy going that way. For whatever the reason was, it seems to be like they go in all in with this drugs thing, and they use it against everybody. Anybody who doesn't like, Petro pisses them off, and suddenly Petro, yeah, you're a drug dealer.
And that's Gustavo Petro, the president of Colombia, that they've started going after the last couple of
yeah,
days.
yeah, they've gone in very intensely after him, very intensely after Mexico. Everybody's a drug dealer. It just seems to be that's their go-to when they want to really be aggressive. It seems like that's the line, the narrative that they think better suits that aggressive posture than the kind of humanitarian. We're going to save Venezuela. That was that for so long, for decades. That was the propaganda, right? But now it's like we got to protect ourselves. They're a threat to us because of their drugs. It's outlandish, but they he just seems to think he can get away with it, and I can understand why he thinks that they've gotten away with so much, So it's I think this is ultimately linked also to the Holocaust in Gaza. I think that the level of permissiveness has just gone next level with the whole Western apparatus, the whole Western imperialism. It's just the level of permissiveness now is so high. I think they feel liberated to be so much more aggressive. I think what we're seeing in West Asia and Gaza, I think, is kind of coming to Latin America.
And with regards to the drugs thing, now, so this is the Canadian angle. There's a couple elements of the Canadian angle. The one element that Puglisi reported, the so-called defense reporter in the Ottawa Citizen. He reported on there's Canadian naval vessels in the Caribbean through Operation Caribe. They frame what they're doing as drug interdiction. We also know that through NORAD, about 30 years ago, NORAD took on a quote unquote war on drugs kind of mandate. So presumably there's Canadians through NORAD working with the Americans on sort of targeting drug, they call it drug, looking for drugs, whatever. But obviously we're seeing examples of that's morphing very much into sort of regime change kind of efforts. Um, so there's some Canadian connections there. I think there's also a bigger, more important Canadian connection in terms of the fact that Canada really was right at the center in 2018, 2019, 2020 in the bid to overthrow the Venezuelan government through the Juan Guaido self-declaration, through the Lima Group sanctions and stuff like that. Can you maybe just talk a little bit about, that was just, I guess, one phase, as you talk about in your book, over 20 years of trying to oust the Venezuelan government, but it was maybe the most intense, sustained phase. Can you maybe just talk a little bit about Canada's role in the sort of bid to oust, overthrow the Bolivarian government, Maduro, etc.?
Yeah, they got really aggressive. They were always negative on Venezuela. I found even the NDP. I think you probably know better than me with Mulcair and those guys. They pretty much went along with the whole lie that Maduro's a dictator. They went all in with that. Even if they were critical, it was like kind of like the way the Democratic Party is. They reinforced the most damaging lie, but then they critique it from them, in a really weak way. So with the Lima Group, what happened was Canada basically formed as that hot group. But again, the whole basis of this was we got to restore democracy to Venezuela. It was all about. It wasn't the whole drug thing was just not even a thing. It was not a factor in the propaganda. But what happened with the Lima Group was eventually imploded because just a lot of governments changed, including Lima. Lima's, of course, based in Peru, and Peru's elected a kind of left-leaning government under Pedro Castillo, who was then overthrown in a very very dubious manner. I would say it was a coup, and it became now it's been under unelected rulers ever since. So and nobody talks about it because it's they're right wing pro U.S. So nobody even cares that they have unelected governments running the country for a few years now. Um, so
But the Lima Group was like a coalition that Canada was
yeah,
at the center of like trying
right,
to overthrow a coalition of countries, the governments trying to overthrow Maduro,
right,
including all kinds of regimes that didn't even have any democratic
yeah,
pretense.
yeah,
Uh,
and that was the absurd part. They had no democratic. A lot of them didn't have any democratic legitimacy whatsoever, and including the main one, Lima or Peru. And then when it elected a progressive government, then of course that was one of the things that kind of brought down that informal group. But and then to just add to absurdity, for the past few years now, Peru has no. Governments are unelected, very brutal, and nobody talks about it because it's a U.S. client. I mean, nobody talks about Ecuador. Ecuador has become a major If you follow my follow, I follow Ecuador closely. I think at this point you have to just say it's a dictatorship. It's a right wing dictatorship, and its government has become a major, just totally infiltrated with drugs. The family of the president is of Noboa is implicated in drugs, and none of this is a factor to the U.S. In fact, Rubio made one of his bellicose statements against Venezuela using the drug angle, and he did it from Ecuador, which has become a major drug center, illegal drug center. So it's like they don't really care about manufacturing consent. It's like they almost don't care whether people believe any of this. It's just they're basically almost. I feel almost like a taunt to their whole to the world, saying, we're going to do this, we're going to put out a ridiculous pretext, and we're just going to do it anyway. We're going to blow up boats in the middle of the Caribbean. No effort to capture the people, to try any kind of that's all just out the window, and it's just full on. Fascist behavior, just wide open, and it's really it's frightening. It's part of the strategy, of course, is to frighten us and to frighten Venezuela. It's like we have no limits, we'll do whatever we want. They're really going all in a much more intensified way with intimidation.
Well, that gets me to question about the region. So what's Lula's reaction been, and what's Gustavo Petro's reaction been? Like, I mean, that has to be one of the biggest restraints on U.S. action is the possible reaction in the
Sure.
region. It's not just a reaction in Venezuela, but the reaction across the region. What's that been so far?
It's funny that Gustavo Petro, the president of Colombia, Colombia is basically a semi-occupied country. It has hosts like 7 military bases in Colombia. I mean, some would dispute that, well, they're not really U.S. bases, but I don't think there's really any. I mean, the U.S. has been so tight with the Colombian military for decades. Everybody knows what that means. If a progressive government's elected, you have the a very dangerous situation because your military cannot be relied on to actually follow your orders. So it's a very dangerous situation. But Petro, and in spite of that, I would say he's been much stronger than Lula, who has been he impugned Venezuela's election in 2024 when Maduro won, but then he immediately recognized Daniel Noboa's fraudulent election in Ecuador. He's basically and he maneuvered to keep Venezuela out of BRICS recently. So he's been very bad. He's been bad, and so it's not. I mean, one positive thing I could say is at least he's not Bolsonaro, who would be all in. He'd be all in with, yeah.
But he's not criticizing the American
He
bombing.
is,
You assume would be a minimum of that.
yeah, he has been criticizing, but one of his statements he made recently was that American interventions don't always do sometimes do more harm than good, or something very lame like of that nature. It's like, really, Petro, like, or really, Lula, when do you think they did good? Like, could you please point to the example? It was weak. He's been weak. He's been weak, and often even I'd say uh, really bad. So it's discouraging. They're always pandering to the. I think Oli Vargas has a good analysis that even the left governments in Latin America have kind of turned internally, just focusing on their internal politics, and they don't want to take on the issue of Venezuela. They don't want to defend Venezuela. They're very frightened to defend Venezuela. I'd say former President Rafael Correa is one of the few people who I see defending Venezuela. Like, he sat down, had a very respectful interview recently with Maduro, but for the most part, they are very frightened to be seen as pro Maduro, and that's been very bad because that's weakened solidarity, it's weakened the regional response.
Well, that gets to my final quick question is actually you kind of alluded to it, the NDP. So here we have, or in Canada more generally. So I have, I think Canada is sort of passively supporting. I mentioned the assistance through Operation Caribe, through NORAD. That's fairly passive. I haven't seen any evidence of very active Canadian support, but we haven't seen any criticism of the Canadian government of what Trump's doing. So we
Right.
haven't seen any sort of statement in that direction. We saw a statement, sort of celebrating the fact that Maria Machado
Greenland.
Corina Machado won the Nobel Peace Prize, and she's obviously calling for U.S. Attacks on her country. But one of the things it's stunning to see as somebody who's right now engaged in the NDP leadership race is that nobody from the NDP has made any comment on this question. And
Yeah,
my assessment of that, I mean, in one sense, it should be pretty easy to just take a shot at Trump, right?
right,
It shouldn't be a particularly controversial. Just take, oh, Donald Trump is
right.
being like a belligerent, like just like he's been belligerent towards Canada. So that should be a fairly easy kind of shot to take. But my guess is that there's a desire not to be, labeled like pro Maduro or whatever. That's the fear that would stop someone like an Avi Lewis from
Right.
from coming out and making that comment. So I guess maybe just to conclude, like sort of not just the NDP, but the Canadian government's unwillingness to come out in any way and sort of say, hey, maybe it's not good for Donald Trump to blow up boats in the Caribbean. Yeah.
Well, I mean, if you think, look at Cuba, like, Canada has actually, it's one with the rare exceptions. Canada has maintained cordial relations with Cuba. And other countries have as well. You could of course get in. I know you've gotten into the weeds of how it's not really as good as what it seems, but still, that's probably a factor in why the United States just hasn't invaded Cuba. I mean, imagine how different things could be if for years Canada had actually been respectfully inviting Maduro to. I think you actually recommended that once. Invite Maduro to Canada, engage respectfully with Venezuela. Like what you can do that with Saudi Arabia, not Venezuela. Like that's crazy. It's crazy. Venezuela is a democracy. You'll go into the details however you want to do it, but it is. But regardless, imagine if how different things could be if countries like Canada had engaged respectfully with Maduro all these years. How much more difficult it would be for the likes of Trump to threaten them now with war and with military strikes.
Well, let's hope that it doesn't go any more intense than what has already happened. There are a lot of signs that suggest it might escalate further. Let's hope it doesn't. Thanks a lot for coming on to Talking Foreign Policy. Again, Joe Emesberger is the co-author of the book Extraordinary Threat: The U.S. Empire, the Media, and 20 Years of Coup Attempts in Venezuela. Thanks a lot for coming on.
Thank you, Ace. Good luck.